Please turn with me to Psalm 111, and we'll read that as an opening text. Psalm 111. Psalm 111 says, "Praise Yahweh. I will give thanks to Yahweh with all my heart, in the company of the upright and in the assembly. Great are the works of Yahweh. They are studied by all who delight in them. Splendid and majestic is his work, and his righteousness endures forever. He has made his wonders to be remembered. Yahweh is gracious and compassionate. He has given food to those who fear him. He will remember his covenant forever. He has made known to his people the power of his works, in giving them the heritage of the nations. The works of his hands are truth and justice. All his precepts are sure. They are upheld forever and ever. They are performed in truth and uprightness. He has sent redemption to his people. He has ordained his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever." 7 weeks ago, we began counting towards Pentecost in accordance with the commandment in Leviticus 23, 10-14, where we were directed to remember the wave sheaf offering of the first fruits of the barley harvest. It's truly amazing how quickly 7 weeks moves by, seems to have flown by. Yet here we are. The Pentecost celebration conveys several lessons of significance for Yahweh's people. In addition to the agricultural meaning of the harvest, it's also a time when we remember the outpouring of Yahweh's Spirit upon his apostolic assembly, his apostolic congregation. Yet there's another importance to the Pentecost season, as it reflects the time described in Exodus and Deuteronomy, when the people gathered at Mount Sinai to hear the words of the covenant. The word covenant is a word that a lot of people are uncomfortable with because they see it as being something very ancient and kind of archaic, right? We don't really use the term covenant in everyday conversation anymore, do we? So if it makes you more comfortable to think of it as an agreement, it's simplifying it a little bit too much from its technical sense, because it's more than just a simple agreement. But if you think of it in simple terms these days, in modern terms, as an agreement, in this case, an agreement between Yahweh and those who serve him, then maybe it might help you to visualize that a little bit better and conceive of it a little bit better. So considering the covenant is an important aspect of Pentecost. And just for a few minutes today, I wanted to focus on that. Oftentimes I'll bring a message of just kind of a more practical message during the feast days. But I wanted to return to some of the basics tonight because I won't be able to be with you tomorrow. And I know that that Richard will cover some of the other things, and he'll continue with the theme of the feast. And I have great confidence in him. So tonight I just want to focus on just a few of the lessons of the Feast of Weeks. And it's not always the it can sometimes be a little bit more high level, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I think it's something that we need a reminder of from time to time. In fact, this 48-hour period that began with the Sabbath day and continues into Pentecost, with beginning with sundown tonight, brings to remembrance that momentous event that we see described in Exodus and Deuteronomy in the history of ancient Israel, when Yahweh delivered his Torah, his instruction. People say Torah, they translate that typically as law, but it's much more than law. It's his instruction, his Torah. When Yahweh delivered his Torah in the form of a covenant to the people. And when they subsequently ratified or confirmed, it's another term for ratified, that covenant before Yahweh. So that term covenant, let's go back to that for a minute. It's pretty interesting and has a meaning and seriousness that I believe is taken much too lightly in our modern day. As our opening text in Psalm 111 shows, Almighty Yahweh takes his covenant very seriously. And in fact, it says that he has commanded it forever, right? Verse 9, he has ordained his covenant forever. Why would he do that if he didn't expect that it's something important for us to remember? And Pentecost provides a perfect day for us to remember that. So just what exactly is a covenant? And why is it important? Why is it important that we remember Yahweh's covenant? I'm not saying this so we can have an academic exercise, right? This is not a college lesson on a college campus. I want you to understand the concept of covenant because it's important that we remember it. If it's something that he's ordained forever, and if it's something that Yahweh says in verse 5, he will remember his covenant forever, well, shouldn't we remember it too? So what exactly is a covenant, and why is it important that we remember Yahweh's covenant during the sacred season? Is it in fact important to each of us, or is it okay for us to just kind of take it lightly? That was then, this is now, and just we can keep moving forward. Well, I think you know the answer. In addition to the agricultural significance of the Feast of Weeks season that we're observing, with its connection to the end of the wheat harvest, which is what this is from the agricultural standpoint, Yahweh uses, of course, agricultural lessons to teach metaphorical, symbolic, spiritual truths. It's also the day when, as I said, we remember both the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the Apostolic Assembly on the day of Pentecost, as we saw in Acts 2, and the receiving and ratification of the Torah at Mount Sinai, as we see in Exodus 19, 20, and so forth. It should be a time each year when we resolve in our hearts to remember, to embrace the covenant that Almighty Yahweh has made with his people. And by the way, that's the name of the message tonight, the Feast of Weeks, learning to embrace Yahweh's covenant. The Feast of Weeks, learning to embrace Yahweh's covenant. As I stated just a moment ago, Psalm 111 gives us a sense of just how important Yahweh views the covenant that he has made with his people. So Psalm 111 verse 5, he has given food to those who fear him. He will remember his covenant forever. He will ever be mindful of his covenant. That is, he will have and it's put a little bit differently in this particular translation, but he will remember his covenant forever. Some versions say he will ever be mindful of his covenant. In other words, he will always have it in mind and will not allow it to be forgotten. And then in verse 9, as I said, he has commanded his covenant forever. In this version, it says he has ordained his covenant forever. It's interesting that preachers who firmly state that there's no longer a need to observe Yahweh's covenant or his Torah will often agree that Yahweh's covenant is forever. So you have to ask, it begs the question, what does a covenant consist of? Well, it consists of laws, instructions, and other things, right? It's part of the agreement. So if it's an agreement that is meant to last forever, how can individuals say that it's something that no longer has to be taken into account? And making a distinction between the old and new covenants, when you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, which are really misnomers, but when you make a distinction between the old and new covenants, they will oftentimes explain away the need for the Torah, right? Somehow or other, we're led to believe that the conditions of Yahweh's covenant have changed to such an extent that the Torah no longer enters the picture. Then terms like grace and mercy and justification are used in this context, but not understood. Those terms are somehow divorced from their association with Yahweh's Torah, with his instruction, and are explained apart from their relation to the Torah. But can that really be the case? I'm trying to better understand those points of view, but I must confess that I always fall short of the logic in that kind of thinking. How can something be forever and yet be set aside in the way in which people are describing it? Is Yahweh's Torah no longer important in the lives of his people? Is it really possible to enter into a covenant with Yahweh without keeping his royal Torah? Has the Holy Spirit somehow replaced the Torah, or the need for people to maintain an orderly way of life, which is what the Torah gives you, right? In accordance with all the so-called outdated laws, judgments, and precepts, I just don't believe that's the case. But let's turn to the word of Almighty Yahweh and allow that word to penetrate our hearts and minds to find some of the answers. What exactly is a covenant anyway? Well, let's go through a few definitions. According to Webster's dictionary, a covenant is a formal binding agreement. So I said before, it's an agreement But let's add to that a formal binding agreement. It's formalized between two parties. It's not just some casual thing. It's something that it's kind of like probably the closest thing that we have in our present day is a contract, right? And that's a very simplified way of looking at it. But a covenant is in effect a contract. And a treaty might be a better way to look at it as well. A compact. What are the biblical terms, the not just the dictionary definitions, but what are the biblical terms that are translated covenant? Well, I don't mean for this to be an entire word study, but let's look at least a couple of those. So in the Old Testament, the term is berith. You might write that B-E-R-I-T-H, berith. And it means a covenant, alliance, or pledge, according to the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon. The root of that, bara, means to select, to feed, to eat. And then, interestingly enough, a closely related word, also bara, but spelled a little bit differently. It's a similar sounding root word, but it means, listen to this, it means to cut down, select, or feed. It's interesting to note the different connotations of these related words. And then the context is often dictated by the particular places where you find those words in the scriptures. You have to wonder what feeding and eating have to do with cutting down. And what does cutting have to do with choosing or selecting? It's interesting. These are words that are just kind of strange, right? With bara, berith, select, feed, eat, cut down, select. What is that? It's just very strange. Well, if we go back to the simple definition of the word berith, if you look it up in just something, a simple resource like, we often use Strong's dictionary. It's not the best resource to look in depth at these words, but if you want to just kind of keep it simple and you look at a simple Strong's concordance, which has a Hebrew and a Greek dictionary, the simple definition of that word berith means, and I'm going to give you exactly what it says in quotations, right? In the sense of cutting, a compact, because made by passing between pieces of flesh. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'll explain it. Let me just repeat that. It means, the word berith means in the sense of cutting, a compact, agreement, a compact, because it's made by passing between pieces of flesh. Is that a weird definition or what? Well, what is that even referring to? So to get a better sense of what I'm driving at here, let's go to a prominent passage where this term covenant appears, that it's mentioned early in the sacred scriptures. And I'm talking, of course, of Genesis 15. So let's go to Genesis 15 and we'll begin reading with verse 1. And let's see what that term berith has to do with. So we're going to read the whole chapter, actually. So just bear with me. This is Genesis 15. So after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram, who later became Abraham, in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you," Yahweh says to him. "Your reward shall be very great." Abram said, "O Yahweh Elohim, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" So Abram was promised an heir, but he says, so far I don't have an heir. I just have this person who's not really he's not my seed, right? He's not my issue. And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." In other words, a foreigner who's not really from my, flesh and blood is going to be my heir. And then the word of Yahweh came to him in verse 4, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." And he took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you're able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." In other words, they're going to be as numerous as the stars that you can't even count them. So right now, you don't see it. Right? It's like I was saying in my sermon earlier today. We don't always see what Yahweh has in mind. But you can't tell right now, but your descendants, believe it or not, right? Your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars that you're not even going to be able to count them. But notice what it says in verse 6, because he didn't say believe it or not, right? I just added that as a little gloss, but that's not what it says. Verse 6, then he, Abram, believed in Yahweh. He believed him. And he, Yahweh, reckoned it to him, Abram, as righteousness. And the connection between this and the covenant becomes evident when you look at something like Romans chapter 4, where it talks about the term justification, righteousness. And It's translated by N.T. Wright, for example, as covenant righteousness, as covenant justice, more accurately, covenant justice. It's interesting that that connection is here, and there are reasons for that that we won't go into today. And he said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you the land to possess it. He said, Oh Yahweh Elohim, how may I know that I will possess it? He said to me, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. So we're going to do offerings here. Verse 10, then he brought all these to him and cut them in two. Notice that. So Abram brings these things that Yahweh says, and then he cuts them in two. Very strange to us, right? In Western society, we don't have any clue about this. These are not things that we do. We don't engage in these kinds of offerings and weird animal sacrifices and things of this nature. That's okay. We don't do that kind of stuff, but they did. And it's important that we understand the reasons why they did that. So he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid them each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon him, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. So at this point, Abram sees, in essence, a vision of what's going to happen to his descendants in Egypt. Elohim said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. And it came to pass exactly as Yahweh said. Elohim said to Abram, verse 14, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve. Of course, that was Egypt. And afterward, they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So he says that, so your descendants are going to go through this thing, but they're going to be brought back here to this land. I'm going to give this land to them. So he's giving Abram, in essence, the outcome of the covenant that he's making with them, because this is what's happening right now. He is at this very moment making a covenant, making a compact with Abram. And this is what I want you to understand here. It came about, verse 17, when the sun had set, that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. So a flame passes between the halves here. On that day, Yahweh made, and here it is, on that day, Yahweh made a covenant. So this is summing up everything that we just read. That's what happened here. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant. He made a compact. He made a berith with Abram, saying to your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Their land, it's not going to be their land anymore. It's your land. It's going to be the land of you and your descendants. So he's saying to them, this is the covenant I'm making. And the way that the covenant was made was by this action that Abram took. So notice those verses, particularly 17 and 18, a flaming torch. It says, by the way, that in 9/11, he divided these animals in the middle. So just kind of file that away for a minute. He divided those animals in the middle. He brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other, two halves. And then later in verses 17 and 18, the flaming torch passes between the pieces. So Yahweh makes a covenant with Abram in a very strange way. Well, the term translated as Yahweh made a covenant in verse 18 is an interesting term, because it literally reads that Yahweh cut a covenant with Abraham. He cut a covenant with Abraham. That's what the word berith means. Cut, to cut. It says that it's a cutting that's done here. We know from the text that the fire passed through the pieces of the sacrifice that Abraham had laid out. So let's kind of put all this together. So the concept of making a covenant, literally cutting a covenant, as symbolized by the cut pieces of the sacrifice, and the parties to that covenant passing between the pieces, is meant to convey the idea that if one of the parties to this agreement breaks the covenant, what happened to that sacrifice should be their end as well. In other words, that thing that cut through there, if Abram breaks that covenant, if his descendants break that covenant, it's almost as if to say, may it be done to them as happened to these animals. Kind of a brutal way of thinking of something to a certain degree, right? But it's meant to impose something serious. It's meant to be a serious. What's the word I'm looking for? I guess we use the term enjoin, a serious charge to the parties of this covenant. Nowadays people just agree to just about anything. They don't care, right? You go and you get a piece of electronic software and they give you an agreement, right? You ever read through that agreement? Congratulations, I haven't either. Right? You go through an agreement and it says read this thing, and then it's like 16 pages of legalese. Then you get down to the bottom and you're supposed to check the thing. I agree, right? What are you going to say, right? You're going to go read it. You're going to get a team of lawyers to read it for you and then go move forward. No. And they know that you're not going to read it. But this is not, so this is why nobody takes things like that seriously. What are they going to do, right? No one's going to take you to task if you don't do everything exactly like it's done. And so on and so forth with most of the agreements that we do, except the ones that have the binding force of law, like a contract or some such thing. But for the most part, people say, I promise and I agree and this, and they don't really mean any of that. And there are no consequences most of the time for those kinds of things. So no one takes that seriously. But imagine a covenant that you make in a manner in which animals are killed or slaughtered right before your very presence, and you see the slaughter, you see the end result of that slaughter. I know the Western mind can barely conceive of something like that, right? Because the Western mind think, oh, animal cruelty and whatever. But you know what? If people would see something like that, might they take their agreements a little bit more seriously? Am I advocating going back to these kind of sacrifices and the kind of sacrificial ways to do it? No, I'm not advocating that. But I'm just impressing the point upon you that if people truly understood the consequences of their actions and what it means to break your word, I have a feeling that we'd see a lot less breaking of the word. So a man and a woman get together. Well, it's not even a man and a woman anymore these days, right? But typically, just for argument's sake, we'll say a man and a woman get together and they enter into the compact of marriage. We even say still sort of, in some circles, most people won't even say that, but we'll say a covenant of marriage. And the prophets refer to it in any event as a covenant of marriage. And people will enter into that and they'll make all sorts of promises and just run slipshod over those promises. If there were real, very real consequences to that, would people think twice before they would break their promises in marriage and everything else? I think so. So the concept of making a covenant, literally cutting a covenant, as symbolized by the cut pieces of the sacrifice, and the parties to that covenant passing between the pieces, is meant to convey the idea that if one of the parties to this agreement breaks the covenant, what happened to that sacrifice should be their end as well. And sometimes salt would be included in the sacrificial act. That results in the terminology, the salt of the covenant. You see that in Leviticus 2, among other places. The idea there, what does salt do? Salt is a preservative. So the idea there is that and I lost my place, sorry. The idea there about the salt is that of preservation. In other words, as salt is a preservative, adding salt to the sacrifice indicated that the covenant would be binding. It would be preserved forever. So to briefly summarize, cutting a covenant, a berith, is an extremely powerful concept that means that anyone who enters into such an agreement should pay with their life, should they violate the terms of that covenant. So covenants are serious. Looking back on our definitions, we can see how the term cut down comes into play. What about the other ideas conveyed in the definitions? Well, it doesn't take much imagination to understand that when one makes a covenant, you're making a choice, you're choosing, you're selecting. Remember, select, you're choosing, just selecting entry into a compact with the other party. You're not just being roped into it, you're making a decision. Yes, I'll enter into that covenant with you. And then the feeding part comes into play after the agreement is made. I'm going back to the early words, feed, choose, right? So this refers to, again, ancient practice that the two parties to an agreement often seal the deal in the ancient world with what? A communal meal. You see that with Jacob and several people, right? Laban and et cetera. They had a communal meal. This is not unlike we actually have a representation of that in the modern day when we have state dinners. So that's not unlike what they did back then, entering and having a meal together after an agreement, a treaty or whatever it may be. That's not unlike two government delegations in our modern day having a state dinner at the conclusion of formal negotiations. Okay, so we can see then how the term bereath encompasses all these ideas. It's a really powerful concept. What about the term covenant in the New Testament? So that's all Old Testament scriptures, right? What about the term in the New Testament? Is it found there? Sure it is. It's found in passages such as Mark 14:24, right? So let's look at that very briefly. Like I said, I don't want this to be an entire word study, but I just want to look at a couple of examples. So Mark 14:24 says, and he said to them, this is Yahshua speaking to the disciples at what? At the Last Supper. He said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. So there's a blood of the covenant, right? There is a covenant. And then you see that also in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 6. So let's take a look at that. 2 Corinthians 3:6. We take these things sometimes way too lightly. It says, and let me go to verse 5. Let's go verse 4 for context. So 2 Corinthians 3, verse 4. Such confidence we have through Messiah toward Elohim. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from Yahweh, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And then, of course, Hebrews 8, that reiterates the concept of the old covenant and the new covenant, okay? So the word here is not bereath, but in the Greek, it's the word diatheke. You might write that diatheke, diatheke, and it means a disposition, a contract, a covenant, or a testament. And of course, this word, the diatheke, is where the concepts of the Old Testament and the New Testament actually originated, because they convey the master's words in Luke 22:20, in which he refers to the new covenant in my blood, the diatheke. The term diatheke is consistently used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, translated for Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Septuagint. So the word diatheke that we see in these verses that I'm reading to you here are used in the Greek version of the Old Testament to translate the Hebrew term, guess what? Bereath, right? So it's the same term, the same concept. So consequently, the words in the Hebrew and the Greek are identical in meaning, despite the attempt of some misguided commentators to attach the concept of testament, as we consider last wills and testaments in our day. That's not right. It's that term testament is not really a correct term. It's really covenant, right? So it's the old covenant and new covenant, and there are different connotations there that we don't have time to go into. But the idea is one of a covenant or a compact between Yahweh and humankind. So now that we have a better idea of what a covenant is and of the consistent language used to describe that term in the sacred scriptures, where do we go from here? So what? There's a covenant. And the Old Testament is called bereath, and the New Testament is called diatheke. So what? Why is a covenant necessary? Is it necessary? And why did Yahweh enter into one with us? So whether you're considering the covenant from the perspective of the bereath made with Abraham and then later at Sinai with the children of Israel, or you're considering the blood covenant that Yahshua made, which is really one and the same, why do we need it? Well, why does anyone enter into an agreement? Isn't it because of some kind of benefit to all the parties involved? Typically, in the case of agreements between people, this is certainly true. But it's interesting because in Yahweh's case, what can we possibly offer him in return? Usually the agreement implies something that I get something, he gets something. Well, it's not quite like that. This is what's known in scholarly circles as a Suzerain Treaty. I don't want to get too complicated, but it's a Suzerain, a Suzerain Treaty. So scholars describe the covenant that Yahweh made with man as being typical of a certain type of covenant or treaty made in the ancient Near East, and it's known as a Suzerain Treaty. What's a suzerain? A suzerain is just a fancy word for a ruler or a nobleman that you would normally see operating under a system known as feudalism, feudalism. What does all this have to do with anything? Well, just hang with me for a little bit. We don't do this often, so just hang with me. In a system employing feudalism, a subject, oftentimes called a vassal, would render service to the nobleman. And in return, the nobleman would provide protection and land. So it's interesting to note the blessings that Almighty Yahweh describes for those who embraces his covenant. In addition to an abundance of the bounties of the earth and of promises for children, for the descendants, the blessings in embracing Yahweh's covenant certainly include protection and a claim to the land of Israel. So in a suzerain type of treaty or covenant, which this is, right? What we were given at Sinai, what was ratified at Sinai was a version of a suzerain treaty. The noble person is way above, head and shoulders above the subject. So it's not like you're really doing anything for that purpose. That's where grace comes in, because in grace, the very term grace means that the superior bows, almost condescends to, in a good sense though, almost condescends to the inferior. So in a suzerain type treaty or covenant, the ruler in effect is exercising a certain degree of grace or mercy because he's not receiving material gain from the agreement. Again, what can we give Yahweh? Does he need our, whatever, money or whatever? Nothing. However, he does expect that the other party remain loyal to him and exercise a degree of respect, a degree of reverence, dedication, and service. That much he anticipates. Isn't that what we committed to when we agreed to be part of Yahweh's people? In a greater sense, we're all part of Yahweh's people because we're all his creation. However, it takes a conscious effort on our part to willingly submit ourselves to his covenant of life. I'm not talking about legalism here, so don't go there. I'm talking about basic, Father, you have blessed me with all the blessings of life. So I owe you my service and dedication and my loyalty and how I live my life. Because I recognize that I'm a human being created in your image, and therefore I render to you praise and honor and glory, and I don't seek it in other places, because that seeking in other places is something known as idolatry. But yet we turn everywhere. I mentioned this in a sermon earlier today. We turn everywhere for our source of strength, except the true source of strength. So today's a good day to think about where our loyalty lies, I guess is what I'm saying. It takes a conscious effort on our part to willingly submit ourselves to his covenant of life. Do we do so of our own free will? Do we do so willingly because we place value on that covenant? Do we prove this by our dedication in keeping that covenant, in our willing obedience to the ruler of the universe who entered into this pact with us? In other words, do we live up to the potential that we have as human beings? I've said before that I really don't want to hear from anyone when you do things that are wrong. I don't want to hear, well, I'm only human. We've become accustomed in our culture to say that. Oh, I'm only human. Stop. We have to think about that differently. Because to say I'm only human is to say that I've been created in the image of Elohim. You shouldn't be using that, sorry to break it to you, but you shouldn't be using that as a justification for mediocrity. You should be using that as a thing that as a badge of honor. Oh, I'm human. I'm human. That means I was created in the image of Elohim. Not even the angels were created in the image of Elohim. You want to see it? Go read it in the scriptures. We don't have time to go through it now. Human beings were made special. Human beings were made to reflect the glory of Almighty Yahweh on this earth. So when you say, oh, I'm only human, as if that's somehow justification to ignore the worst parts of your nature, you're barking up the wrong tree. Let's read the account in Exodus of the giving of the covenant to Israel. Let's come back to covenant, and then we can draw some conclusions based on the word. So we'll go to Exodus 19, and we'll begin reading with verse 1. And this that you see here in this passage reflects this sacred season of Pentecost. So Exodus 19, verse 1, in the 3rd month, after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Moses went up to Elohim, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." And if you look at many passages in the scriptures, you're going to see that it parallels this section. We're going to look at a couple of them in a moment. This concept of becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What are priests? Priests are teachers. What is a kingdom? A kingdom reflects Yahweh's kingdom, right? Which is what we're looking to in the future. Yahshua said the kingdom of Yahweh is at hand, and it was inaugurated through his life and his death and his resurrection. And now we are representatives of that kingdom in the midst of the things that are happening around us. And a holy nation, a nation that is set apart, that is consecrated for service to Almighty Yahweh. So when you look at this passage, you have to consider ultimately that Yahweh is building through this covenant between himself and his people. He is building a spiritual house. He's building a temple. This is truly an important concept when we consider the pattern of his worship and its progression from the tabernacle in the wilderness to the physical temples built by Solomon and Herod up until the present day, as Yahweh's spiritual temple is being edified even now. So if you go to 1 Peter 2, verse 5, it tells you about the logical culmination of that temple building. 1 Peter 2, beginning with verse 5. You who are sitting there listening to me right now, and me, you also, as living stones. Why also? Because we bypass verse 4 that talks about the cornerstone. Coming to him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of Elohim, you also as living stones. So we have Messiah, who is the cornerstone of that spiritual temple. But you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood. And there's the connection to Exodus 19. You're being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood. Is that not an honor? So why do sometimes we lightly consider that, right? You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to Elohim through Yahshua Messiah. And this temple language is throughout all the scriptures, both Old and New Testaments. When you look at the book of Romans, it's loaded with temple language. Paul knew his scriptures. It's loaded. What do you think? We read verses in isolation, so we don't always see the connections, and we're not always able to connect the dots, and we miss something because of that, right? But when you look at Romans 12, and it tells you, to offer yourself up as a spiritual sacrifice, right? I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of Elohim, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to Elohim, which is your spiritual service of worship. What is that? It's temple language. And you see it all through the book of Romans, and you see it in many other places as well. This is temple language that Peter is giving us. He's saying, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood. To do what? To offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to Elohim through Yahshua Messiah. So these sacrifices are undoubtedly the same kind of sacrifices that Paul is referring to in Romans 12. Living sacrifices, not animals, right? But the spiritual sacrifices of your praise to Yahweh and of your reflection of his glory into the world. And there's so much more that we could say about that. So notice again how closely this language parallels what we found in Exodus 19. We are being built up as a spiritual house and a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices. You see it also in Ephesians 2. Let's look again at Paul describing the same thing over in Ephesians 2:19. It's everywhere. And it's something that we need to pay attention to. So then, verse 19 of chapter 2 of Ephesians, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens. You, who's listening to me today, myself, you are no longer strangers and aliens as we were at one time, because we weren't born into Israel, most of us, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of Yahweh's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yahshua himself being the cornerstone. That's what we just saw in First Peter, in whom the whole building, what building? The temple, right? There are people out there who keep thinking, well, when is the third temple going to be built? And the temple, that's going to be the sign of Messiah's coming when the third temple is built. And they're all looking for the red heifer and the third temple and the third temple and the third temple. Forget the third temple. The only temple that matters is here, right now. And that is the spiritual temple built upon the foundation stone of Yahshua Messiah, with every single one of you and me built as stones, living stones built into that spiritual temple. I don't care if they built 6 temples in Jerusalem, physical brick and mortar temples. That's not the temple of Yahweh. This spiritual thing that's being built is the temple of Yahweh. Having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yahshua himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building, the whole temple being fitted together is growing into what? Well, it says it right there, right? It's growing into a holy temple in Yahweh, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of Elohim in the spirit. And he goes on speaking from there. Friends, we're being built together for a habitation, a dwelling of Yahweh in the spirit. But in order for the spirit to dwell in the temple, it doesn't dwell in pollution, right? So think about it in terms of this ancient system, but get rid of the ancient system from your head and bring it into the present day. Yahweh doesn't abide in the midst of corruption. He abides in the midst of holiness. So if he's abiding, if his spirit is here, if his spirit was given on the day of Pentecost, as we saw in Acts chapter 2, and it continues to the present day, then that spirit dwells in the midst of a people that is being built into a temple. So if we have elements of the temple that are unholy, then where does the spirit dwell? Because the spirit's not going to dwell in the midst of perversion and corruption and immoral decay. Right? And I'm not just talking about sexual things, whatever. I'm talking about the whole business. I'm talking about every aspect of our lives. We are supposed to be the ones that constitute the temple. We're the ones who constitute the ambassadors, the priesthood that is meant to teach this crazy world that has gone absolutely off its rocker how to live. And if we don't do it, who will? We're being built together for a habitation of Yahweh in the spirit. Are we up to the challenge? This concept of a habitation of Yahweh in the spirit is brought out in an even stronger manner in 1 Corinthians 3. Paul's not done, right? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 3 and we'll look at verse 10. According to the grace, this is 1 Corinthians 3:10. Let's go verse 9 for context. So he tells the Corinthians, "So we are Yahweh's fellow workers. You are Yahweh's field, Yahweh's building." There it is again. "According to the grace of Elohim, which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful. Each man must be careful, and each woman must be careful how they build on it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid already, which is Yahshua Messiah." That's the ultimate foundation, right? Yahshua is the chief cornerstone. The cornerstone is exactly that. It's the one by which every other stone is laid. Because if you use a foundation stone, a cornerstone that's crooked, then the building, you can build a building several stories high. And if the foundation, the cornerstone in particular, is not correct, it's not leveled, right? I'm not a builder. I can't, you don't want me to build anything for you, I promise, okay? But I know enough to know that a cornerstone has to be level, and it has to be perfect, because if it's not, the rest of the building is going to be crooked, and eventually it can topple down. But we know that our cornerstone is Yahshua the Messiah, and he's perfect. No one can lay a foundation other than that. Now, if any man builds on the foundation, like he did, Paul, with gold, silver, but then there are other building materials, precious stones, but there's also wood and hay and straw, right? There are good ways to build and there are not so good ways to build. What kind of material are you using, my friend, to build? Are you in fact a stone, or are you a clump of straw? You know that a building is only going to be as good as its weakest point. So if everything around you is strong and yet you are just a lump of clay in the middle of an otherwise strong building, what happens with your part, right? Verse 13, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show, because it is to be revealed with fire. And the fire itself, that's the trials of life, the things that are happening, in the day-to-day, will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. Do you not know that you are a temple of Yahweh, and that the Spirit of Yahweh dwells in you? There it is again. If any man destroys the temple of Yahweh, Yahweh will destroy him, for the temple of Yahweh is holy, and that is what you are. Are we hearing this? Are we reading this? I don't mean for this message to be a rebuke, my friends. We're all included in this message, including me. I always love Chuck Swindoll saying that when he wants to figure out what to tell people, he figures out, what do I need to hear? And then I preach it and I let you listen in. I promise you, we're all in this together. But are we really paying attention to this? Are we just kind of floating along in life? And it's not meant to be a rebuke. If anything, it's meant to be a wake-up call. What are we doing with our lives? Are we just pursuing after the day-to-day accoutrements of life, or are we paying attention to our responsibility to give a witness to this world? Why are we allowing the world to dictate the culture? Why are we allowing the world to dictate the order of the day? We should be the ones proclaiming what the order is, not taking our orders from people who don't have a clue as to what's going on. And we sit and we watch these things happening in the news, et cetera, and we wring our hands. And am I talking about political action? That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about, at a minimum, the way we live our lives. Sometimes I think we live our lives just looking for the next handout, right? What is the next thing that we can do to, get a better house or a better car or whatever? Is that what we're here for? Are we here just to do what everybody else does, or are we here to stand for something? This passage is not directed to a specific individual, but rather the context shows that Paul is addressing the entire group as he reminds them that the entire assembly of Yahweh is considered a spiritual temple of Yahweh. It's a spiritual temple, and we edify that temple by keeping the covenant of Yahweh, by following his Torah, by being observant and mindful of his commandments, and offering spiritual sacrifices. Of course, the scriptures are filled with references to the greatest sacrifice, which we recognize by our acceptance of the shed blood of Yahshua the Messiah. And we also can consider that the temple is edified as each person offers a spiritual sacrifice in daily living, as described in Romans 12, which I already read. Being transformed in the renewing of our minds. Are we doing that? Are we being transformed in the renewing of our minds, as it says in Romans 12, 1-2? Or are we doing the opposite of what Romans 12, 1-2 says, which is becoming conformed to the way that the world does things? If you look, breathe, sound, imitate everything that you're seeing out in the world, you're doing it wrong. We all are. If there's no difference between the way the world does things and the way we do things, between the way the world thinks and the way that we think, we're doing it wrong. Yahweh raised up a holy people in ancient Israel and delivered his Torah to them during this season, right? For what purpose? So that they would present the witness of his holiness to the world. In the same manner, in our modern day, we are built up a spiritual habitation, a dwelling of Yahweh in the spirit, to present a strong, spiritually educated witness to the world of Yahweh's holiness. This is the world desperately in need of Yahweh's holiness. By the way, this is not, that witness is not an us versus them. On the contrary, it's trying to draw people in. You can't draw people in by being arrogant and elitist and I'm better than you and I'm holier than thou. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about living your life with joy, living your life with hope, living your life with uprightness, showing people that no, the way that you see people doing things, the trolling on social media and the backbiting and the jealousy and the constant flaying of one another and the lashing of the tongue and the violence that's committed against one another, both physically these days and emotionally with words, the verbal violence that's being inflicted upon one another. We got to show them that there's a better way, that that's not the way to do things, that there's a better way to do it with love, with grace, with joy, with hope. The covenant given so long ago remains the basis of this spiritual habitation, this spiritual dwelling. It is what educates us. It's the safe place. It's the refuge to know how to be like Yahweh so that we may teach others to do the same. Do we understand the importance of the meaning of that covenant? It was given to us so that we may receive blessings and be a blessing to those around us. What does it mean to reflect Yahweh's glory to the earth? Does it mean to do us versus them? No, it means to bless the earth. To bless the earth with the fact that Yahweh is king. Yahshua is Messiah. Yahshua is king. He saved us. That's a great thing. That's not a thing to, us versus them. This is for the entire world, right? This is what was done at Pentecost. And people from all nations, every tongue, so that no one would be left out. It was given to us so that we may receive blessings, yes, but more important, what we can give Yahweh in return is our respect and obedience by living and witnessing our faith in agreement with the covenant. And when we do that, we're doing just that and blessing the world. Isn't it true that if you have a good relationship with your parents, you wish to maintain a good reputation of the family name, right? I was like that as a kid. I wanted to, I stayed out of trouble, not because I was, I don't know what they call goody two shoes or whatever, or because I didn't want certain things, whatever, like normal teenagers do or whatever, but because I didn't want to shame my family, You do that by living as you were taught by your parents, right? At least if they gave you a good message to teach. Not everyone has that blessing. I had that blessing. My parents weren't perfect, but they were good, upstanding people, and I wanted to honor them. You adopt their value system, then you make it your own. And by your example, you lead others to adopt that value system. This is what I'm talking about with the word of Yahweh, right? You lead others to adopt that value system because you believe in it so much. How much more so is this true with Yahweh and his ways? The covenant that we celebrate today is important to us, not because it's some legalistic thing that we all have to cross every T and dot every I and walk around stiff-necked and everything. That's just foolishness. It's joy. It's life meant to be lived in abundance. The covenant is important to us, not only because of the blessings that we gain by observing it, that would truly be a purely self-interested and self-serving motive on our part. That's not why we do it. I don't like the answer when I ask people, why do you serve Yahweh? Because I want to get to the kingdom. I've never liked that answer. I think that's a horrible answer. If that's why you're serving Yahweh, more power to you, but please stay away from me. I'm not interested in you serving Yahweh and walking with me because you want to get in the kingdom. That's not why you do it. You do it because, first of all, it's the right thing to do, because you're preserving the family name, because you love your fellow human beings who are also created in the image of Elohim, and because you want them to live. More than anything, the covenant must be important to us and must be valued by us, because by keeping it, we glorify Yahweh and we promote his holiness, his distinct manner of living to the rest of the world, so that the world can be filled with the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the seas. You may consider that regardless of whether we are discussing the physical tabernacle or the temple or the spiritual temple of our day, the result is the same. The sanctuary, whether it's physical or spiritual, serves as a sign of Yahweh's people being linked in a special way. And that special way is defined by the covenant. Notice also that it was not entered into with everyone, but rather with those who embraced it and agreed to follow it, right? I don't really have time to go through all this because I don't want to keep you all night, and I have to really start bringing this to a close, but I had the rest of Exodus 19, if you want to write it down, 7 to 25, that describes, what came after, in the midst of Sinai. And then you remember that between chapters 20 to 24, you're given the main points of the covenant, right? It's delivered in 20 to 24, starting with chapter 20, which is a summary, which is what? What is Exodus 20? It's the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments is kind of in encapsulated form everything else that you see. It's just that everything else is kind of the, it's like, here are the 10, here are the main categories, and now it's explained in greater detail, right? But let's jump down to Exodus 24, just the first 11 verses, okay? I'm not going to be much longer, I promise. Exodus 24, verse 1. Then he said to Moses, come up to Yahweh, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you shall worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come near to Yahweh, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of Yahweh and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which Yahweh has spoken, we will do. That's the ratification of the covenant, right? We'll do it. Thank you. Yes. Stamp, right? Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. It's witness, right? He sent young men of the sons of Israel. They offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to Yahweh. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. What is that? It's the blood of the covenant, right? Which Yahshua emulates. It's just that he does it in the truest fulfillment in the New Testament. Then he took verse 7, the book of the covenant, and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Covenant received, covenant ratified. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant. Where have we seen that before? Which Yahweh has made with you in accordance with all these words. Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and Nadab and Abihu were the sons of Aaron, and 70 of the elders of Israel, all the leadership, right? And they saw the Elohim of Israel. And under his feet, there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Sapphire is a very, very deep blue. Must have been very beautiful. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. And they saw Elohim, and they ate and drank. Covenant, treaty, state dinner. Yes? So here we read that the people willingly accepted the covenant and ratified it. Once he was sure that they committed themselves, Moses offered the blood of the covenant. And the agreement was sealed with a communal meal between Yahweh and the leadership of Israel. And then you can see the parallels between that and the event that we engage in every year at the Memorial Supper, when in effect, we also, once again, remember the blood of the covenant, right? And the symbols and emblems that are instituted there. So much going on here. And I hope it thrills you as much as it thrills me. So much more could be said about the blood of the covenant. Of course, the main part of that discussion, of course, would center on the sacrifice of our beloved Savior, Yahshua Messiah, as we do each year, and as spoken about in the book of Hebrews, etc. Okay, suffice it to say that without Yahshua's sacrifice, none of this would be possible. So let's focus on this aspect of the covenant for just the few minutes left of this message. When we embrace the covenant, like we do on Pentecost, we also embrace Yahshua and his sacrifice. Do we value it, or do we treat it as something light, as something of little importance to us? Let's seriously consider this question. And I don't have time to go through all this right now, but we've been through it before. But Hebrews chapter 8, right? I'm not going to go through all of it, but Hebrews chapter 8 talks about the new covenant. And then you compare that to Jeremiah 31 to 34. And when you review those passages, especially Jeremiah 31, when it says, let's look at Jeremiah 31. We won't go through Hebrews 8, but the basis of it is Jeremiah 31. And it's repeated word for word, in part, in addition to some other things in Hebrews 8. Because Hebrews 8 talks about the old covenant and the new covenant. It's really a renewed covenant, not really a new covenant, as if it's a new thing. It's a renewed covenant. But Jeremiah 31, this is the basis of what you see in Hebrews 8. It says, behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares Yahweh. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. So there's the inclination, not the inclination, there's the implication of a spiritual covenant, right? It's not just a legalistic, right? It's something that's in your heart. And we're not talking about obviously the physical heart, the heart as a metaphor for something being so internal to you that it's part of your very heart, your very center. And I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know Yahweh, for they will all know me. Why? Because it's going to be in your heart. From the least of them to the greatest of them declares Yahweh. For I will forgive their iniquity because of the blood of the covenant, and their sin I will remember no more because of the blood of the covenant, right? So when reviewing this passage, one might ask, was there something wrong with Yahweh's covenant? Which is what sometimes people will say. In fact, this is where some people want to put the emphasis, downplaying Yahweh's covenant with ancient Israel and demeaning those, that covenant that nobody could keep and blah, 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 right? Demeaning those who wish to keep the Torah. But what does the text actually say? Look more closely at this text. And as a matter of fact, let's do even a step more. Let's go briefly to Hebrews 8. Okay, and let's look at the specific section that references this. And let's see what the writer of Hebrews, who was it's very possible that he was a priest because he knew things very well. So let's look at verse 6, and then just a couple of verses after that. Okay. Hebrews 8:6. But now he has obtained, Yahshua, he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. And this is an allusion to Jeremiah 31. For if that first covenant had been faultless, if the first covenant had not had a fault, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, behold, days are coming, says Yahweh, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel. And then he quotes that whole Jeremiah 31. So what is the problem? What does the text actually say? Read it again, verse 8, for finding fault with them. The covenant? No, the people. The problem was not the covenant. The problem was the people not keeping the covenant. There's no inconsistency implied between the old and new covenant themselves, but rather the inconsistency lay in the one party to the covenant. Remember what happens? The one party doesn't go through, right? They both go through the thing, and the one party doesn't do what they're supposed to do. They should really die, right? Because that's what the breaking, the cutting of the covenant means. But what keeps them from dying? Grace, right? The inconsistency lay in the one party to the covenant, Israel and later Judah, who failed to live up to their end of the agreement. The entire context shows that the people failed to keep the covenant, yet Yahweh showed mercy and provided a better covenant in that, one, the new covenant would be based on the shed blood of his only begotten son, and two, he would ensure that the law would be written on the individual hearts of the people. And of course, this would be accomplished by means of the Holy Spirit. So the blood of the covenant, Yahshua's sacrifice, covers the grace part of it, and the giving of the Holy Spirit covers the hearts of the people having the law in their hearts. So knowing the importance of Yahshua's sacrifice in relation to the covenant, let's examine two final scriptures as I draw this message to a close. Okay. And you know what? I'm just going to read them. I'm not going to offer a lot of commentary. Hebrews 10:26-31. Let's do that first. Hebrews 10:26. For if we go on sinning willfully after we receive the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of Yahweh and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, and again Yahweh will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living Elohim. So that's the first one. Do we treat the covenant as something just a blasé attitude towards that covenant, or do we take it as something serious? And the second passage, 2 Peter 2, beginning with verse 20. 2 Peter 2, verse 20. For if, after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the sovereign and Savior Yahshua Messiah, they are again entangled in them and are overcome, the last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would be better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than, having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb: a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow, after washing, returns to wallowing in the mire. Two pretty rough passages, right? Two pretty rough passages. And I don't mean to end this message on a somber note, but I mean to end this message on a somber note. We need to take these things much more seriously, and this is a good time to reflect upon that. This is a high day, this day. I'll be, by the grace of Yahweh, my wife and I will be in the air tomorrow, but I promise you, we'll be considering these things, and we're not going to be, having a ball out there. This is a day to rejoice because of the love that Yahweh has shown us and the grace that he's shown us, but it's also time to reflect. And it's that reflection part that I'm focusing on at the moment. Let's agree to value the covenant, which is sealed with the blood of Yahshua, or we will be in danger of a serious violation and breach of trust. Let's consider the value each of us personally places. You, personally, what do you place? What value do you place on Yahweh's covenant in your life? Only you can answer for yourself. Only I can answer for myself, right? Only we can determine that for ourselves. I hope and pray that we each assign the covenant a prominent position in our lives, and that we demonstrate the faith by embracing that covenant and rendering our obedience to Yahweh. How? By seeking to be more like Yahshua, having that humility, having that respect for Almighty Yahweh and his word. Each year, as we remember the giving of the Torah and the confirmation of that Torah, the ratification or confirmation of that Torah, as our forefathers did, right? We rejoice. Yeah, this is a day to rejoice. We rejoice to know how valuable, it's a day to rejoice, but to do it with intelligence, right? We rejoice to know how valuable Yahweh's covenant really is. It was given by Yahweh in love for the good, for the blessing of his people, to glorify his name and to promote his holiness to the world. It was forged in the furnace of affliction, and it's not over. But it was forged in the furnace of affliction as a group of slaves was taught the true meaning of freedom and what it means to be a nation. It was ratified with blood. It was bought with a price. We count the blood of Yahshua to be of supreme importance to the people of Yahweh and indeed for all humankind. So let us be grateful. Let us act with gratitude to Yahweh for his blessings and renew our zeal and dedication in keeping his covenant and witnessing Yahweh's way of life to the world in the name of Yahshua. May Yahweh bless each and every one of us. May he bless your families, and may he give you peace and keep you in every way.